16 truths about insulin resistance. Truth number 10, HOMA-IR, which is how we measure insulin resistance, compared to omega-6 ratio. You know, we sound so intelligent, so informed, so educated, so knowing when we say, you got to get your omega-6 ratio in order. What does that mean? And then you'll get the people who feel real educated, go, well, ancestrally, the omega-6 ratio was 1:1. And now, post-industrial revolution, which is about 100, 200 years ago, we've been 4 and 5, and that's kind of what we should expect today. Yeah, all that's probably true, but I'm finding, and I was also one of those people, by the way, so really intelligent back in the 90s when I got into medicine. Now, I don't think it's that useful. The point of this video right now is to understand essential fatty acids as it relates to insulin resistance, HOMA-IR, in the omega-3 ratio. Be more articulate, more specific, and have more actionable information. These are about labs. These are about actual results that you can use. So I hope you follow me, but I'm questioning the value of the omega-6-3 ratio at all. But I'm giving you some really useful information. And spoiler alert, at the end of this video, which is going to be probably pretty long, is I'm going to go more deeply into the conclusions I get from this video in 2 weeks in a video that really spells it all out for you. Here we go. Let's get started. So, omega-6 ratio and HOMA-IR, and here are all the words: seed oil, arachadonic acid, fish oil, which is omega-3, EPA, DHA, linoleic, omega-3, omega-6. These are vocabulary words you should have down pat now. One thing you need to know before we go further, which is about me and my perspective in presenting this information to you, and that is that I believe in really a few things, and my filter is exactly this. 2 people that were very influential in my life, didn't know them personally, but these quotes in their works. One is Peter Drucker, who was all about business management. Really profound. They're both dead now. But he says, if you can't measure something, you can't change it. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. This speaks, in my world, to labs, blood labs. Getting your labs done, however small or however large. When people work with me, we do large panels. Of course, I'd like to be comprehensive. I'd like a bigger complex context in which to assess things from, and therefore to be able to make a protocol for that particular person. But back to Dr. Peter Drucker, that he's not a medical doctor. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Data matters. Data matters very much. Your labs matter. Don't be winging it. I took this because I had this and I feel a lot better. You can function on that level only so far. If you want to be a little more aware, self-aware, a little more intelligent, a little more specific, data matters. Labs matter. Your labs matter. Okay? The other is Ivan Illich, really fascinating guy. He was actually a Catholic priest way back, and I think it was Austria. You can say, well, it's pretty obvious what he's saying. Effective healthcare depends on self-care. I mean, self-awareness. So much is left out of the equation when you go to see your doctor. What part are you doing to bring yourself healthy? Hopefully, you're using your doctor as a coach, not as a commander. Here's the reality that we live in today, and maybe that's always been forever. I don't know. Can speak of today, what we all want to be true. Simple, but wrong answers. Everybody wants that. Just take this new supplement. It will change everything. It's the thing we've been so deficient on, or this pharmaceutical, or this nutraceutical, this supplement. It goes on and on. The other is complex by right. Notice the complex but correct answers. Notice the books, the library there. Yes, there is some self-knowing here. Part of it is academic, part of it is self-assessment, but work is required. I hate to put it out there, but this is how I talk to my clients, and I get them to participate instead of just idly listen to what I'm saying. And basically representing the same reality, pills and surgery, everybody wants it. Bariatric surgery is a great example. I'm not criticizing people who get that. But most of the people who get bariatric surgery 5 or 10 years later are back to where they were. So if they didn't learn how to implement some changes themselves and thinking something else is going to do it for them, more than likely it's not going to work long term. Really interesting research out of bariatric surgery too. Lifestyle change, nobody wants to do it. Too much work. I'm going to run a quote from RFK Jr. that I think is profound, really sort of lays it up where we are today. And I hope you appreciate it. He says it probably a lot better than I do. And it's profound. And I hope that he continues doing what he's doing, or at least what we're hoping that he's going to continue doing. Okay, here we go.
Today, Americans' overall health is in grievous condition. Over 70% of adults and a third of children are overweight or obese. Diabetes is 10 times more prevalent than it was during the 1960s. Cancer among young people is rising by 1 or 2% a year. Autoimmune diseases, neurodevelopmental disorders, Alzheimer's, asthma, ADHD, depression, addiction, and a host of other physical and mental health conditions are all on the rise, some of them exponentially. A healthy person has 1,000 dreams. The sick person only has one. And right now, there's 60% of the people in this country who have only one dream. If they can make it through a day without pain, with energy, without having to take medications.
All right, so the third and final thing is, I'm putting this together. This is what I've seen over about 30 years of being in medicine, is that those who really make a successful change in their life, and there's a few components. One is the labs, the data. They really need to have their own data, and they know what to change. It's just not an intuitive process. They need to have trust, obviously, that in themselves and whoever they're working with for their coaches, as I say. And they need to have a plan. The data, in my view, determines the plan. And it's not just looking for looking for values that are within range. You'll find out how that's faulty coming up today a little bit. But it's the pattern that that person has in their data that, for me, allows to create a specific protocol. It's not like saying, hey, your vitamin D is low, get it up. Well, how about the vitamin D with the hemoglobin, with a few other things? It gives them a unique pattern that says, hey, and also it makes it much more valuable to them. So it's the data, it's the trust in that a change can happen, and it's also a plan. If it's not my plan, it's their plan, but a plan, something to follow. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. Let's get into it. Okay, so back to our regular scheduled programming today. The skinny on fats, HOMA-IR, and the omega-6-3 ratio. Is it valid? How do we use it if it is valid? And if it isn't, why isn't it? Okay, here's how we're going to do it. 3 levels of analysis. The first, we're going to look at omega-6-3 ratio relative to HOMA-IR and other insulin and glucose and so on and so forth. So you'll see where it stands. You go, oh, that's interesting. Then we're going to go deeper, just looking at omega-6, and that's more than one, and just looking at omega-3, and that's more than one. Then we're going to go deeper to look at the constituents, arachadonic acid and linoleic acid, seed oil, plant-based, animal-based, if you really want to know. And omega-3 is all animal-based, better with fish, marine versus aquatic, but better with fish, but it is also in terrestrial animals as well. To know what's actually happening, write down from the data that I'm embarking on now, and we're always going to divide it into insulin-resistant people and non-insulin-resistant people. What is the difference in these two groups on everything we're going to compare? So how important is the omega-6-3 ratio really? Let's look at HOMA-IR. This is what we've been talking about, HOMA-IR. So what we say is anybody under 1.5, 1.4 or less is non-insulin resistance. Anything more, so 1.5, I don't have it marked out here, but you can sort of say this end is non-insulin resistant people. And way down here, there's diabetics and there's severely insulin resistance, of course. What do we see? Well, gosh, and we want a lower, right? Ideally, we'd be brought down to 1, but this is a trend line, and my trend line of the people that I've been seeing did not go down to 1-to-1. I've never seen anybody 1-to-1. So that's the trend line. You can see people have gotten lower, and there's much more data than this little box, by the way. The graph is shrunk down. All right, so now you get that out of the way. We see, well, basically, the lower the ratio, the healthier, right? We're looking, saying a lower ratio is better. We find the lower the ratio, the lower the HOMA-IR. Okay, well, that fits. Makes sense. Good. All right, now let's look at age. And this isn't as people get older. This is looking at older people, mid-range people, and younger people, and saying, what are their differences? So when we look at this line, and this red is the insulin-resistant people, we're saying older people who live to 80, who are insulin resistant, have lower omega-6 ratio. So that's a good thing. So they moved, in order for them to be older, they had to have a better ratio. So far we can say, well, this is kind of pretty useful information, isn't it? But we don't know, is it more omega-6, less omega-6, more omega-3, less omega-3? You tell me. What's your guess? How are you going to use this information? Even though we go, well, from all that we know, it's correct. Of course, lower ratio. If you want to live a long time, you need to be healthier. Healthier is a lower omega-6 ratio. Okay, If you're satisfied with that, you can stop watching now. We're going a lot deeper. All right, omega-6. Now what we did, we just simply added it as fat, one great big ball of fat. We added the omega-6s family and the omega-3 family, and we have a total amount of fat. So by adding those two before, we get a total of around 45. That's the omega-3s and the omega-6s. And what do we find? The higher that number, the lower the insulin resistance. The higher the number of fat. So that's just fat we're talking about. It's polyunsaturated fats, but it's fat. Now we're using that same ball of fat and we're breaking in that number over here into non-insulin resistant people by age. So we're saying non-insulin resistant people by age, their amount of fat, that amount of fat of essential fatty acids, didn't really change that much. So you can say, all right, that's around 44, and the 80-year-olds had about 43. It's the same number. Over 65 years, that's incredible. That's a trend line. That's not me marking it in with a magic marker or something. That's a trend line saying maybe that's the number you should be at. Maybe that is a really important number to reach, not more or less. I just wanted to say, have you ever wondered where Dr. Goldkamp gets all his data? And what gives him the right to say this is associated with this and therefore da-da-da-da-da-da? It's the work that I get out of all the clients that I've worked with. I put them in a huge database, spreadsheet, from their scatter plots, and it is proven to be invaluable. And it's something that I obviously encourage all doctors to do because it's the clear way of showing relationships between various issues. But really the upside for clients, it gives them little things that we can address that dramatically change their health. That's the key. The little things. There's not like, oh my gosh, I got to go do this. Nope, it's not about the big things. It's about the little things. You change certain ratios and it's amazing what happens, whether it's hormonal or not. And I'm in the midst of actually doing research around a big LabCorp panel that I've already done about 100 people for, but in talking to certain researchers that have helped me saying, do it again, add to it, and you might want to consider some other tests. It has become very exciting to be part of this research now in building this out. So the upside here is saying, have you ever thought about becoming a client? If you have, if you're interested, just send me an email and I'll say, this is what it means. And this is how I work with people in one of two ways. We focus on the one big panel that I'm doing my research on that I've done with all my clients. And others are much more comprehensive. We do a couple of other panels, genomic work, nutrient deficiencies, and hormonal panels, neurotransmitter as well. Consider it. Now, the insulin-resistant people, we find they had, when they were younger, for younger insulin-resistant people, had far lower amount of fat. And those who were older had far higher amount of fat. This is fat in the blood, not so much fat on your body. Okay? All right, so the second level analysis, breaking down the omega-6-3 ratio into omega-6 off to the left, omega-3 off to the right. What do we got? But wait! What is this showing us? Let's start over here first. This is a cleaner graph, even though it's the same data. This shows HOMA-IR, as people higher HOMA-IR, they have lower omega-3, and they have lower omega-6. But didn't we just say that, wait a minute, those who had a HOMA-higher, worse, were diabetics, extremely worse insulin resistance, they had a higher omega-6-3 ratio. But yet both decreased. So we're now looking at, is it the total amount of fat or is it the ratio? I'm saying the ratio probably isn't that important, but it was interesting to notice. Both omega-6 and omega-3 have come down, decrease. Those who have higher HOMA-IR or higher insulin resistance have lower amount of fat. This reality begs the question, is HOMA-IR insulin resistance increasing? Is the insulin resistance increasing because total fat is decreasing? Or is it because the omega-6-3 ratio is increasing? Okay, third level of analysis. Let's go deeper still. See what specific fatty acids is the most effective. Omega-6 and omega-3. Now we're breaking them down. Arachadonic acid, linoleic acid, EPA, and DHA. Which will it be? So what does this show us? This is HOMA-IR, all in all, what we simply did. So we're not breaking into we're not breaking into IR people, insulin resistant people, and non-IR. It's just everybody. We're just looking at the two omega-6 fats and the two omega-3 fats and we're looking at which one changes the most as insulin resistance gets worse. Okay, what do we see? So for linoleic acid, seed oil, plant-based seed oil, and you also get it through eating meats, by the way. So if you never ate another vegetable in your life, you would still have linoleic acid in you. And that's not because you're using it to cook with and so on and so forth. If you just ate terrestrial animals and or fish, you would still get some linoleic acid. They eat it, we eat them, we get some of that, okay? So it's never a zero. Okay, what we find is linoleic acid really doesn't change that much from what, 26 to maybe 22? Over 26 points of insulin resistance from severe to not at all to non-insulin resistant. That's not much of a change, but it's a little bit. Arachidonic acid goes from what, call it 13, 14 down to 5. That's pretty significant. Now let's look over at omega-3. EPA, which is down here. So EPA is very little in our body, 1.5%. Not much. And DHA is 3. So it's still, they're pretty sparse. But even that, with those that are increasing, I just called these out, they have a pretty dramatic dive, especially DHA has a steep decline. So right now we're saying that omega-3 decreases more quickly in moving from non-insulin resistance to insulin resistant people than does omega-6. But also arachidonic acid pretty much moves together with EPA and DHA. Maybe not as dramatic, but pretty dramatic. Here's a point to identify so we can have a little more coherent conversation here. So I've covered on previous videos, what is the midpoint range? I put in these different volumes of data and I said, here's the average, let's use this number. So for linoleic acid, the mid-range number, right? Above is too much, below is too little or deficient, if you will. And it's 25. Arachidonic acid is 12. DHA is 3. Omega-3 is 3. So here's an easy way to remember that. For omega-3, double EPA and you get 1.5 and you get 3. That's DHA. For arachidonic acid, double arachidonic acid value, 12, and you get 24, but 25 is the number. So the smaller essential fatty acid in this group of omega-6 and omega-3 is half the larger. So we're going to keep on pointing to that so you get a way of understanding what we're talking about. All right, here we go. We just saw the same graphs, right? Omega-6, omega-3, linoleic acid, arachidonic acid, EPA, DHA. Now I put in that mid-range number for linoleic acid, that mid-range number for arachidonic acid, that mid-range number for DHA and EPA. Now let's look. So we already knew that they were decreasing, right? As you got worse, as your insulin resistance got worse, as you became diabetic, as you became obese, these essential fatty acids got worse, meaning you became deficient. Now we get to sort of see a more visual representation of how great that deficiency is. There is a deficiency in linoleic acid, but very little. And this is unfortunately what conventional medicine is focused on, especially out of the Chan School of Public Health and Harvard. It's like, well, you know, we see linoleic acid is really helpful for heart disease and insulin resistance. That's such a small truth. And if you compare it to other essential fatty acids, it's almost not a truth at all, but you can't call them lying. What they did is they just omitted these other comparisons. So now look at arachidonic acid. Clearly this little triangle of below mid-range is a bigger change. Look at DHA. DHA has crashed. So for those who were non-insulin resistant, and I did put in the 1.4, right? Anybody to the left is non-insulin resistance, anybody to the right, so all these are insulin resistant people, it crashed from 3, and it lined up perfectly. 3. From 3, it went down to, where are we, at 1? Yeah, we're at 1. So that's over a 2/3 decrease. So insulin resistant people have 2/3 less midline value of DHA. That's a big deal. What about EPA? EPA goes from not quite 1.5, I'd say it's 1.3 or 4, pretty close. We're splitting hairs, and it's such a small little piece, but it still goes down to almost nothing, to 2. It goes down a whole percentage point, which relative to wanting 1.5, it also drops to 2/3 or 2/3 deficiency. That's a big, look at that triangle. That's a big triangle of deficiency. That's a huge triangle of deficiency. So you get what I'm after? These are instrumental, and we're looking at the fats specifically to find out who changes the most and therefore who can be most helpful. Something you can change. What specifically is affected regarding insulin resistance? All right, now we're getting into a little more details. You thought the last part was detailed. A little more details. So when I look at insulin resistance, the 3 things that I compare to is glucose, obviously, insulin, obviously, and glucagon. So glucagon and insulin are sort of the yin and yang, the opposite, right? So when insulin is low, glucagon is high, and so your body has the ability to make glucose, and basically it comes from various stresses like starvation, working out, cortisol. It doesn't really, we're not going to go into that pathway, but glucagon is the thing that makes glucose, and insulin is the thing that gets glucose out of the blood, right? Into the blood, out of the blood. So that's how they go opposite. So we're looking at all these three and to see how do these fats really all line up? Okay, so linoleic acid, seed oil. What I did, we're just looking at glucose. This is fasting glucose. And this is really pretty interesting. So fasting glucose, all these numbers are fasting glucose, and all these people, and there's a lot more volume than these particular dots. Okay, and there's a 25, which is a midpoint for linoleic acid. What does it show? It's interesting. Let's start with insulin-resistant people, the IR people, as I call them. So again, we say with the healthier, so 85 is kind of like the quintessential healthy fasting glucose number. You can have a little lower and you can have a little higher, and the range is right over here, 65 to 99 milligrams per deciliter, should you want to know. So you can say, well, all this is really healthy. But 85 is the number that really comes out as being like, there you go. I wouldn't grab onto that so much, like you're imperfect if you're 90, you're fine if you're 90. But this data points to 85 pretty clearly, which I find very impressive. So we bring it up. This trend line shows that the higher the linoleic acid, the higher the seed oil, the better the fasting glucose. Now, what about non-insulin resistant people? Well, their levels are all above midline. And yet the more linoleic acid they have is not necessarily a good thing. Look at this. So their midline, they're better. So I had a number of people that actually had fasting glucose down to 55. That's called hypoglycemia, and it can even get lower. So fasting low glucose, these are depressed people. They're kind of what I call brittle people. They're generally depressed, and you can sort of read that into their countenance, and they tend to react to a lot of little things. They're overreactionary, but I believe it's a metabolic reason, and if they address this, their personality is going to change. Whoever thought of that? Stop eating those donuts. Okay, but so if we go with non-insulin resistant people and they have in this trend line more linoleic acid, that's not a good thing. It's going to make their glucose go down further. We don't want that. We want it a good normal number of 85. So when you look at where is that good normal number for non-insulin resistant people, here it says 26. So 26, 25, I obviously stretched the map bigger, the chart bigger so you can see. So it's really not that much of a difference. It seems much bigger than it is. Okay, what about arachadonic acid and glucose? Here we go. Different chart. Notice this. So for insulin-resistant people who have high fasting glucose, that's clearly diabetic, very obese, and they got a lot of problems going on. We find that their arachidonic is very low, 7.5. It should be up at 12. That's midline is 12. So that's amazing. So if they got their arachidonic acid up, and how would they do that? They would eat animal products, and specifically I would eat the whole food animal products, or eat the steak or the whatever the thing is. Don't go be eating arachidonic acid as a supplement, which you actually can do, by the way, but don't do that. If this is the kind of information that you're interested in, you're intrigued by it, it goes a little deeper than you've seen before, and it's also authentic in terms of data that come from my clients collectively. So it's not some abstract out there. It's actual feet on the ground, if you will. It's where the tire meets the road, all those cliches. If this is something you're interested in, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and if you have any specific questions, send me an email. All right, so now for non-insulin resistant people, when they increased their arachidonic acid, they were pretty close to normal anyway, to that midpoint. When they increased it, they brought it right back to 85. Isn't that impressive? Right back to 85. These overlap right there. So you can say the end of this insulin resistant line, end of the trend line is 11.5, and I'm calling it 12. We're splitting hairs, but you get my point. It's right there. It's a sweet spot. So think of that 12, especially when you look at your labs to get that data to make it changeable, right? So now we're going to look at glucose relative to DHA. This is omega-3, right here, omega-3. DHA and EPA, there's your glucose range. And I'm saying 85 is the sweet spot. If you're really looking for a sweet spot. I love this graph, this scatter plot, because this is the trend lines and they crisscross exactly at 3, exactly at the midpoint of DHA. That says something. DHA represents, I believe it's 93 or 4% of the fat in the brain of essential fatty acids. So of all that we've been talking about, DHA is the big brain fat. That's a big deal. So this graph nails it at 3. So it doesn't mean if you have 4 or 5 or 6, you're going to be smarter. It means you need to have this amount all the time to be smart. Okay? So non-insulin resistant people, if they have less DHA, they are hypoglycemic. If they have more, well, and there, so it's really sweet spot. There shows that on that trend line, if they have too much over, their fasting glucose goes up. Whereas the non-insulin resistant people, the more they have, boom, brings them back to 3. EPA is pretty much the same graph. Look at this, don't you think? They need more EPA. Those who are have a high fasting glucose, very diabetic, very insulin resistant, they have a very low amount of EPA. You bring that amount up, or those who are insulin resistant, who have a higher amount of EPA, they have a lower fasting glucose. They're probably borderline non-insulin resistant. Same too. With those who are hypoglycemic, non-insulin resistant people, the green line, they increase their EPA, they bring it back to normal. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. So here I just changed the graph that you just saw into what they call a polynomial graph. It sort of emphasizes there's a sweet spot right up here. The other one showed it was 85. So this gives it a slightly different context, but there's a 3 for DHA, there's a 1.5 for EPA, and you can see that here it shows it a little bit, changing the graph, that it says, well, that sweet spot's a little higher. I don't know if it is or it's not. I know that 85 is really a good number to shoot for. But interesting, okay? The level, get your levels of DHA up, get your levels of EPA up to midline, not just up, but to midline. All right, now we can compare it to insulin, because insulin and glucose are the two things that go together to have that calculation for HOMA-IR, which I've covered probably in at least 30 other videos, so I'm not going to go into the how, it's just the part of the formula, so they're both components. But which is affected more? So here we have omega-6 over here. This whole page is omega-6. Here we have linoleic acid, arachidonic acid. The dotted lines are insulin-resistant people. Dotted lines are insulin-resistant people. Let's look at the blue first. So the blue is linoleic acid. What we find is the insulin-resistant people relative to insulin seem to have, I would call that a non-changing, that it's not effective. So insulin-resistant people relative to insulin, linoleic acid does not really affect their insulin level. But for non-insulin resistant people, healthy people, metabolically healthy people, we find that the more linoleic acid they have, drops their insulin, they're already in a good insulin level, drops their insulin even more. Is that a good thing or bad thing? I don't think you have to have 0 for insulin. You need to have something. But it's just interesting to see that. It doesn't affect insulin resistant people. It does affect non-insulin resistant people. Now let's look at arachidonic acid, the animal fat, right? That's also been vilified over the last 4 decades. Okay, we find that for those with the highest insulin have the lowest arachidonic acid. What we're seeing here is arachidonic acid, as we saw with glucose, really improves their insulin. It really improved their glucose for insulin-resistant people. For non-insulin-resistant people, relative to insulin, there's not much change. I know there's a slight angle there, but relative to this triangle of deficiency for insulin-resistant people from the midpoint is a big statement. So arachidonic acid is important for insulin-resistant people. Okay, now we just made it for everybody. We can pretty much say across the board for everybody, those who have high insulin, fasting insulin, means they're diabetic for sure, need more arachidonic acid. And you can say that a little bit about linoleic, but not that much, because there's the midline is 25. Here's 15 for the midline for arachidonic, so they really need arachidonic acid. Okay, again, the midpoints. Linoleic was 25. Arachidonic was 12 for the omega-6 fatty acids. DHA was 3. EPA was 1.5, half of that. Just a reminder, because that's what we're using for signposts. Insulin for omega-3, what are we looking at? EPA, DHA. Dotted lines are insulin-resistant people, IR people. So what we find for DHA, green here, we find for insulin-resistant people, if they got their numbers up, for those who are insulin high, have high fasting insulin, severely diabetic, severely insulin-resistant, they reported having very low arachidonic acid. Place for improvement. You could say the same thing about non-insulin resistant people. This is DHA we're talking about, that it would improve them even more. So from this trend line of 10, it will drop them down to 1. So in either case, DHA of the omega-3 fatty acids is very important. This triangle is a triangle of deficiency. Get them up to 3. Get them up to 3. Now for EPA, which is like a small little, right? It peaks at, its midline is 1.5%. It's pretty much the same line, don't you think? It looks like, they're the same angle, just a different, limit. Their insulin is not that high for non-insulin resistant people, but more EPA will drop their insulin. Therefore, make them less insulin resistant. That's amazing. That's a little thing you can do. There's a lab you can get. It doesn't cost $1 gazillion, and there's some action you can take. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. Okay, now here's for everybody. Pretty much the same graph, a little less dramatic. DHA is for those who have high fasting insulin regardless. DHA will improve that. EPA will improve that. That's the point. Here's the range we're looking at. By the way, the insulin range has changed over the last 10 years. When I finally started collecting data about 5 or 6 years ago, the range was, I think, 15 at the time. It's gone to 20 here. And I think now, currently, as of today, I didn't change that on the spreadsheet, is up to 25. They don't want anybody to feel fat or insulin resistant by changing the range. Glucagon. Glucagon. I know you don't get that test very much, but it's an important part of the story. And there was a time, and there's still an ardent group of people that feel that diabetes and insulin resistance is a glucagon problem. It's not an insulin issue. It's a glucagon problem. So I'm just measuring it, saying, let's the data, let's make it measurable so we can find out what's going on. So the midpoint, by the way, for glucagon, here we go. There's the glucagon. So midpoint, I'm just going to give you the answer here, is around 75. So 75 would be right about here. So glucagon, here's the midpoint for arachidonic acid, 12. There's the midpoint for linoleic acid, 25. And so what are we seeing? We're seeing that those who have higher glucagon levels, which is not what you want, it's making more glucose, right? They have higher amounts of linoleic acid. Actually, non-insulin resistant people have higher amounts of linoleic acid, will have higher amount of glucagon. Not terribly, because their line only goes up to what, 100? We said 75 was the midpoint. But for insulin-resistant people, there's no relationship. Linoleic acid has no relationship with glucagon if they're insulin-resistant. They're already metabolically damaged enough, in my view, and they've lost a certain sensitivity to respond to that. So it's only for the insulin-resistant people. Same with arachidonic acid. So arachidonic acid here, above midline, creates a higher level of glucagon for non-insulin-resistant people. You could say it's the same for both, but it's only slight. It's not a big deal. It's not a real headlines catcher here. So if you go, all right, where are we at glucagon for the safe middle ground? We're pretty much at that number. We're not off by much. We're splitting hairs to say, oh no, it's a big difference. I'd say they're about the same. So now just looking for everyone and not differentiating between insulin resistance or not, we say those who have higher arachidonic acid, a little bit, the glucagon is higher. Those who have lower linoleic acid, their glucagon is higher. Interesting. This isn't the story you were told, was it? Data. If you can't measure it, can't change it. If you can't measure it, you can't talk about it, right? If you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. Meaning if you don't have data. Okay, so glucagon, again, with omega-3 now. So here's glucagon, midpoint 75. We're doing DHA, EPA, 3. I didn't put the 3 in here, but there's the 3. There's the 1.5. Notice with EPA, we'll start at the bottom. EPA with non-insulin resistant people, solid line is non-insulin resistant people, there's a big deficiency. So as they become deficient, it's exactly at 75. Look at that. Exactly in my measurement, it's 75. A deficiency in EPA will drive their glucagon higher. And I could say here, a deficiency in DHA will drive their glucagon higher for non-insulin resistant people. That's amazing. Okay, I'm going to stop here with the caveat that at the next video in 2 weeks, I'll be going deeper into these particular conclusions that we've come up with now. Now we've gone into the nitty-gritty of DHA and EPA, arachidonic acid, and linoleic acid, and what truths there are in terms of data. That's where my truths lie. If you can't measure it, you can't change it. And if you can't measure it, you can't talk about it. So we'll go far deeper into the omega-6, 3, and what you can do about it, and why it may be more relevant than we think. But really, the point is, what is the actionable information? What can you do now for yourself with this information coming up. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.